The evil attacks against Israel, the wanton slaughter of absolute innocence by barbarians who are now well past the gates, have likely changed the world forever. What does that mean for the exported American experiment of individual freedom and liberty that has created the modern world? What does it mean for you and your life? How should we think about all this now? Well, we wouldn't dare tell you that, but in the midst of horror and despair, we'll try to provide answers and perspective on episode number 419 of the In the Tank podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the In the Tank podcast, brought to you by the Heartland Institute. I'm Jim Lakely, Vice President of the Heartland Institute. We're a national think tank for 39 years of our existence has advanced the American ideal, free markets and free people, and not just here in America, but where we can, other places around the world. I'm going to warn you right now, this is going to be a hard podcast, I think, to get through, at least for me, without crying in anger or despair for the state of the world. What we call the West, the civilization we have long taken for granted, but maybe shouldn't anymore. The unfathomable evil of Hamas's attack on Israel last week was a reminder that the eternal human struggle between civilization and savagery never really ends. But it is important not to look away from the hate and the horrors inflicted by the enemies of civilization. Experts say this barbarous act changes the Middle East forever. Maybe. But what does the fight in Israel say about the future of global liberty, which we've always assumed would remain ascendant forever? And what are we to make of the overtly pro-Hamas sentiment found in American streets, the halls of Congress, the heights of academia, and other redoubts of the ruling class? With us to discuss this are, well, less than our usual crew. Donnie and Justin are traveling together to Dallas to visit with their book collaborator, Glenn Beck. And so they'll probably be back next week. So with us today, we have Chris Talgo, editorial director of the Heartland Institute and regular participant of this podcast. Chris, how are you doing today?
Doing good. I think this is a very necessary topic to address. So I'm looking forward to a interesting, conversation about what's going on.
Yep. Me too. Also with us, back after not being on the show for a little while, is Sam Karnick. You're the publications director at the Heartland Institute, and you're a man who thinks about these issues a lot, even if it's not always part of our core mission here at Heartland to advocate for freedom on, freedom-centric domestic policy. So, Sam, after sharing countless Slack messages with me on these sorts of topics over the years, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Jim. Thank you very much for having me on the show again.
Great. Well, I think you're actually perfect to have on this because of your you take a very long view perspective on this. You have a very deep well of knowledge on the freedom movement and its struggle to against barbarism over centuries, really. And so I know we probably all have a lot to say about this, but let me try to start this conversation in this way. I read this morning that members of Congress yesterday got a classified briefing of what happened and the current situation on the ground in Israel. And many members of Congress were, quote, visibly shaken. The attack, unprecedented in its sophistication from Hamas, included a horror, surreal scene right out of Mad Max with armed paragliders attacking a peace and music festival in southern Israel. Hundreds of innocent civilians were killed there, and the stories from survivors in that part of the attack are absolutely horrific. Indeed, the stories out of southern Israel as a whole are almost unimaginable in their horror. Hardened IDF soldiers were weeping. They'd never seen horror like this in their lives, and those are some of the hardest men on earth. Hamas terrorists went door to door in several kibbutz communities. They went house to house, slaughtering everybody inside: men, women, children, babies. Several media outlets have now confirmed that IDF forces found maybe dozens of babies, infants, beheaded. There are photos of strollers and baby car seats soaked in blood. Guys, this is very difficult to talk about. I mean, this is an evil that is hard for the human mind to even comprehend, especially for those of us who are fortunate enough, blessed to live in a peaceful West. Sam, I kind of feel like the world has changed now. Maybe it hasn't, but we can discuss that. But Hamas has encouraged their soldiers to attack everywhere now, even in the United States. I guess it's a big, broad question, but how does our Western modern civilization confront this kind of evil?
It's going to have to be a civilization. One of the things that has happened to us in the West is that we have become complacent. With the end of the Cold War, we assumed somehow that this was the end of history and that everything would become more liberal and democratic over time and that markets would be free and everything would be fine. But there is in the human heart a lot of anger toward those who have more than we have. There is a lot of devotion to one's own group and the creation of fantastic notions of what one's group really is. You put all that together, the only thing that really holds civilization together and ever has is blood. And that's what we're seeing now. We are attacked. We are all under attack, but we have all been under attack for quite some time now. Quite some time. I look back to 2016, 2015, with the beheading of monuments in the United States, the throwing paint on them and then tearing them down. If you go back to the French Revolution, there were incidents like this. If you look at the Russian Revolution, incidents like this. You look at any number of events in human history. There are forces in the human soul that, when unleashed, are just horrific, unimaginable to those who want to live in peace and who have values of decency and sympathy toward other people. This is something that can only be stopped by blood. It is based on blood. It is based on the notion that this group, are tied together by blood. And there's an outside group that is not of our blood. And they must be destroyed because they will destroy our blood. They will shed our blood. Interestingly enough, Tom Wolfe, the great journalist and novelist who died a couple of years ago, his final novel was called Back to Blood. And it was all about the rise of ethnicity. And Wolfe continually, in all of his books, predicted what was going to happen in our society, although he would place it in the current day, of course. But in Back to Blood, his whole point was that we're going to see a rise of ethnicity and an intent that people come together through their ethnic ties, their ties of blood. We're seeing that happen now.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it happen not just in Russia, not just in Crimea or the Ukraine or Iran. We're seeing it everywhere, including in the United States, where ties of blood are more important than the very foundations of civilization. That's where we're going. And the only way that it's going to be answered, I hate to say it, is blood itself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Sam. The miracle of the American experiment. I mean, there's been attempts to create societies that are not based on blood, that are not tribal. And the United States of America, in all of human history, has been the best and most successful experiment in that kind of idea that tribes are, your tribe is schluffed aside, and that you bring together, and it is proof, you can bring people together from absolutely disparate backgrounds, histories, as long as you have a shared vision of liberty and freedom and, the United States, and then, and the West, Western Europe, obviously, especially, have been able to maintain that for hundreds of years now. And, if you think back, and I know, Sam, you're a student of history, there's been very few attempts to build societies like this that are based on respect and respect of the other, and putting tribalism away, and not based on blood, but based on shared values. And I guess, Chris, what we're seeing is that those shared values, although shared in the West, are utterly rejected by some of the most barbarous people on earth. I mean, when I was reading and seeing on social media clips of the absolute barbarism that was happening especially in southern Israel, I was thinking to myself, this is the kind of stuff that you read about in history books that the Mongols did, that they would just kill everybody, and because they were the other, and subjugate the rest. And this is what Hamas did. They came in and they slaughtered as many Jews as they could, and they collected women and children to bring back with them to Gaza as human shields, and to do other unspeakable things to them when they had them in their custody. I guess there wasn't a question there, Chris, but what are your, did you have similar thoughts, civilizational thoughts about this when all this was unfolding over the last week?
I'd say yes. I remember when Barack Obama said that the arc of history is bending towards, what he considered like justice and, equality. And I think that was naive at the time. And we are seeing the fact that was a naive position. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. Obviously, what Hamas did was reprehensible in every sense of the word. I just have nothing but sympathy and empathy for the Israeli people who are dealing with the the ramifications of this, and this is going to be generations of pain and suffering. I think Sam talked a lot about the genesis of this, and I think this conflict obviously has a long history to it, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the reactions on different sides here. But one of the things I just want to make crystal clear is that Israel was the victim of this. Israel has every single right to go in and annihilate Hamas. And when we think of war, I think we don't understand that there's a fog of war, and that war is extremely messy, and that there's going to be innocent civilians that unfortunately, die as a result of this. But I think that we need to maintain unity in defense of Israel, and we need to ensure that they have our backing. They are our greatest ally in the Middle East. Middle East, does not have many thriving democracies, and Israel is one of the only thriving democracies in that region. And I mean, I'm kind of going off on some tangents here, but I think one of the reasons why there is such antipathy towards Israel, and it's happened since 1948 when the state was initially founded, is because Israel has become a very prosperous nation, and I think that has produced feelings of jealousy and envy, and this notion that like the plight of the Palestinians is solely due to the Israelis' existence, and we know that is just not true. It's not a zero-sum game. Palestine and the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and unfortunately the people who have let Hamas represent them in the Gaza Strip do not understand that fundamental premise. So I think that it's not just going to take Israel going in there and terminating every single Hamas terrorist. I think it's also going to take a cultural shift within the people of Gaza to not only coexist peacefully with their Israeli neighbors, but to also understand that their horrible circumstances that they live in is not due to Israel, and that they need to take more responsibility for that. So I know we're going to talk about a lot of stuff here. So those are just kind of like some of my opening thoughts, and let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I actually saw a promo video put out by Hamas bragging about how they were digging up water pipes and turning them into rockets. You wonder why Hamas doesn't have any water infrastructure of their own if they dig it all up. And it's a perfect example of what Hamas's mission is. It's not to exist as a country that's welcomed into the world of nations or the United Nations. It's to kill as many Jews as possible and to annihilate them. And Sam, I've heard comparisons. We've all heard comparisons of what happened in Israel to what happened in America on 9/11. 3,000 people died in the United States. And if you compare the populations, they say this would be like 20,000 people being killed on 9/11. And but even that I don't think is quite right. I don't actually really like that comparison very much for a couple of reasons. One, bin Laden actually expected to kill at least 50,000 people in the World Trade Center. And I always remember that. If he had told his Satan spawn minions in Al Qaeda to take flights just an hour later, that's what would have happened. They would have killed tens of thousands of people in the World Trade Center. They hit the planes hit the World Trade Center. I think the first one was 8:46, and the other one was just at 9 o'clock, or maybe very close to that. But a lot of people hadn't gotten to the building yet. They were picking up a coffee and a bagel on the way in, or the one business that lost the most people, Cantor Fitzgerald, was a finance firm, trading stocks. So of course they were all in the office because the floor opens at 9. You got to get yourself ready, but a lot of people weren't in there yet. So bin Laden actually expected to kill tens of thousands, 50,000 minimum at the World Trade Center that day, and it was just. They took earlier flights, and the miracle of the FDNY and the police department in New York and individuals getting themselves out of there. Many, many stories of heroism. And then, I don't mean this to sound insensitive, but when you fly an airplane into a building and bring it down, you're not the only people that Muhammad Atta had to face to face and kill were the people on the airplane so that he could take control of it. We had Hamas terrorists going house to house, murdering and beheading babies over and over again. So, that's what I mean. The level of the brutality here is just, like I said, almost incomprehensible, that there are human beings on this earth that have so much hate and they've been raised generations of Gazans who've been trained from children to consider Jews as animals, not human and deserving. In fact, it is their religious duty to kill as many Jews as possible. Again, I think Western civilization has turned its eye away from this sickness that exists in a too large and very dangerous swath of humanity. And it's not just that they've turned away, they have supported it in many ways. And we're going to get to that. The reaction of some really morally sick people in America to what happened in Israel. But yeah, Sam, I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on those kind of ideas I just threw out there.
Well, let's go back to 1937, before World War II. The rape of Nanking by the Japanese. It was horrific, and it was very much like this. Nanking was a city in northern China. Well, here's the question. Well, first of all, let's mention that one of the things that they did was they threw babies in the air and speared them on bayonets. And this was fun for them. They enjoyed that. A couple of questions arise. One is, what was the government of Japan, what was their real problem with Nanking, that you would inflict such bestial actions upon them? It was a horror that the likes of which we've fortunately seldom seen in human history, but unfortunately seldom means every 10, 15 years. Why? One of the things that is well known about that is that the way those Japanese soldiers were trained was that they were dehumanized. They were punishments and evils were inflicted on the soldiers so badly that they lost control of their consciences. They had no sense of right and wrong left because they had been so abused that as I said, they had no way of making moral decisions anymore. That turned them into monsters. This is going on in our society and in our world now through propaganda, through just cruel behavior. It wasn't Israel that dehumanized Hamas soldiers. It wasn't Israel that did that. It wasn't Netanyahu. It wasn't the IDF. It was their own people. And this is something that I find is just endemic throughout human history, is you dehumanize your own people. You ruin them and then set them off on others. And babies are killed. Blood flows. It's astonishing, but again, it's part of human nature. And what is civilization? Civilization is the putting together of enough strength and power to say, no, this isn't going to happen here. We're stopping it. And this is the choice that Israel has before it. Either stop it and let the world go where it may and say what it wants, or not. And that's where we are as a nation, the United States. We have these same impulses arising. We have people being dehumanized. We have people sympathetic to the beheading of Jewish babies in a kibbutz. We have people expressing sympathy for the people who did that. That's monstrous. This is the United States. So we can't just pretend that that it's just the people who are doing this who are at fault, and the people nearby in the West Bank and in Gaza who are in danger. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and it is going to intensify in the coming years unless and until the forces of civilization decide that they love civilization enough to defend it with their lives.
Yeah.
Hey,
Well,
Jim,
go
can I
ahead.
just address something that we haven't really tackled yet? Hamas has no money. There is no economy. They have no way of purchasing these weapons. So it's pretty obvious at this point that Iran supplied the weapons, the rockets, all the vehicles and everything that they did to pull this off. And then that makes me wonder, so wait a second, how come during the Trump administration, Iran basically wasn't doing any of this stuff? And then I remember, oh yeah, that's because we put on like the most ironclad sanctions you possibly could. I read one account that said that the economy of Iran towards the ending of the Trump administration was on par with Haiti. Okay. As soon as President Biden took office, he chose to not enforce all those strict sanctions. And, everyone's making a whole bunch of hay out of this $6 billion and, oh, it hasn't gotten there yet. And blah, 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 blah. That doesn't matter because Iran has made tens and tens and tens of billions by selling oil to China, Russia, and other rogue states. Not to mention the fact that they have just openly flaunted these sanctions. And President Biden, for whatever reason, is not taking the steps necessary to keep the boot on the neck of Iran. So I'm not saying that we should go in and declare war on Iran, or we should bomb Iran, or any of that stuff whatsoever. But I am saying that in the Middle East, at least in the modern history of it, it understands one thing: strength. And the fact that the United States is not being strong there, and we are trying to negotiate with them, allowing them to possibly get a nuclear weapon. Apparently, they're up to 60% enrichment of uranium here, which means that they are literally weeks away from a breakout. I think that has emboldened them. And this thing did not take, a week or two to plan. There was a report that came out that said this took 2 years to plan. So this has been in the planning stages for a very long time. And, I think, what happened with Russia invading Ukraine, I think that is the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, how we just put our tail between our legs and just left. Not to mention the fact that a lot of the weapons apparently in Gaza right now is part of that cachet that was left over. So I'm not blaming the United States for this whatsoever. And I'm not saying that Iran is totally responsible for this. However, the posture of the United States and our foreign policy has a giant role in the world. And when we are exuding weakness, and when we are trying to allow nations like, Iran and other, rogue states like Syria to get away with, what they are trying to get away with, bad things happen from that. So, I mean, and once again, this is a very complicated issue. There's a lot of, moving parts and a lot of factors that are going into this. However, I think that's one thing that does play a role. And the fact that, we obviously had a enormous intelligence failure. Now,
Yeah.
obviously, it's not just on the, on the U.S. side. Israel also had intelligence failure, but one of the other things that I've been reading a lot is that the United States intelligence in the past couple of years has moved away from having people on the ground and having infiltrators, and we are so dependent on eyes in the sky and technology that does prevent us from having that very necessary local knowledge of what's going on. And I think these are all just factors that, allowed this to happen. Maybe it was inevitable. Maybe it was going to happen, regardless. But maybe the scale and scope of it would have been much less had the United States, once again, had that strong posture in the region and, across the world for that matter, of this is just not allowed. I don't hate to make this a Trump versus Biden thing, but let's just remember that Donald Trump's 4 years in the Oval Office, there weren't many things like this happening. He killed Soleimani. He got rid of the really, really, really bad guys. And, unfortunately, our current commander in chief just does not have that in place.
Yeah. And Trump also canceled all aid to the Palestinian Authority, which obviously used it all for weapons and not for infrastructure, which is quite obvious. And also nixed the Iran deal, which, as they say, money is fungible. You promise $6 billion and then money can go elsewhere. And in fact, if it did take 2 years to plan, certainly Iran expected their money to be, or not their money, but money to become flowing in. So, these decisions by the United States of America have real world and often very tragic results.
And sorry, Jim,
Sam,
one of the really quick point of that, the fact that we are negotiating with terrorists and the fact that we paid Iran, what was it, $1 billion for the release of a bunch of
$6 billion for 5 people they kidnapped.
Right. But I've also that there have been other instances where we have been, negotiating with terrorists. All that does is that incentivizes more of this. And there's a reason why they went in and took as many of these hostages as they did, because obviously they want to get something in return for it. And when you negotiate with terrorists, this is the kind of behavior that unfortunately you should expect in the future.
A quick follow-up.
I mean,
what happened 2 years ago that would cause Hamas and Iran to start planning such a thing?
Very good point.
I don't know. Yeah. And there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we are going to learn over the days, weeks, and months and years ahead. I mean, as I think Andy has put in you did, Sam. Both Andy and Sam put in the private chat that Qatar's hands are not clean in this either, and it's very strange that we have a military base in Qatar when they are basically the banking system for much of global terrorism. So that's another thing that the civilized world, is going to have to perhaps reevaluate. Sam, I was it Thomas Sowell who said that decline is a choice, that for civilizations, decline is a choice. And, the classic example, and people have made this comparison of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire to the United States, perhaps a little overblown, but it is. I am, and I know you are too, Sam. You're very much an adherent to the idea that human nature is what it is, and it's pretty much unmovable, and that civilization is an attempt to curb the worst instincts of human nature and to create a place where people can live in peace and prosperity and happiness, which is kind of the theme of this podcast, which is always a constant struggle. Mark Stein, one of my favorite columnists, and whenever something horrible like this happens on the global scene, he's an excellent person to read. Him and Victor Davis Hanson, probably the two clearest thinkers on this that have popular columns. He noted the other day that on 9/11, the enemies of America and of civilization were dancing and celebrating on the streets of Iran, Gaza, and Egypt. And then after this attack, the enemies of America and civilization in Israel were dancing on the streets of New York, London, and Toronto. So, Sam, what does that say about Westerns? I think that's absolutely 100% correct. And we actually have a video, Andy, it's called Dearborn Celebration. Dearborn, Michigan, one of the largest Arab populations in the United States, has been for decades, which is fine. But they held a rally, and lots of Palestinian flags are flying around. Rashida Tlaib in Congress represents that area. She kept the Palestinian flag, I think maybe to this day, sitting outside of her office, ironically with a rainbow LGBTQ flag very close to it. Not well, obviously realizing that if you flew that flag in Gaza, you'd be dead, and if you adhered to that, if you were LGBTQ plus IA, all that stuff, you would be tortured and murdered by the people that Rashida Tlaib was continually to celebrate. In fact, she was tracked down in the halls of Congress. That's one of the things about covering Congress, is that the members have to go from their offices across the street, often through underground tunnels, to Congress to vote, and then they go back to their office. And the reporters have free reign there, and they can find them wherever they might find them and ask them questions. And a reporter for Fox Business, I believe, was asking Rashida Tlaib why she still had the Palestinian flag and why she's still supporting them when they were beheading babies, infants. And of course, she had nothing to say. But Sam, so just to get to that, back to that Mark Stein point, that there were so many people celebrating on the streets of the United States. And in fact, the police were often deployed to protect any pro-Israeli counter-protesters that might show up. That was the attention and the problem that the police saw. I mean, I think that statement, which is true, that in 23 years, we go from jihadis and people with broken moral compasses celebrating in the Arab world to 9/11 to now celebrating in the streets of our Western, the peaks of our Western civilization. What does that say about how serious the West takes these sorts of problems?
It's certainly a rather dismal thought. And I think that if you look back to 2015, 2016, 2017, and after, what was going on in the United States was a precursor of this. To me, the fighting in the fighting in the streets during 2020, the so-called peaceful protests, those didn't start in 2020. They were going on in 2015, 2016, and got worse and worse. That didn't all happen just because somehow America changed over the course of a year. And it's not because it's bubbling up from the people or even from the human nature itself. What is leaders? It's leaders that are creating these things. When the Japanese soldiers went into Manchuria, as I mentioned, into China for the Nanking massacre, they had been betrayed and dehumanized by their leaders. And the American people are being betrayed and dehumanized by our leaders. And that has been an increasing phenomenon throughout the 21st century. Why that would be the case is something that we need to discuss now and in future, because you can't have freedom without rule of law. You can't have rule of law if your leaders are corrupt. That's simply very straightforward. So what happens with Hamas, as you say, there is no Hamas if there's no money for them. There is no Hamas if the Palestinian people aren't being degraded, humiliated, and dehumanized by Arabs who won't let them live in Arab countries, which would solve the problem immediately. The Balfour Declaration that created what eventually became the State of Israel was called the State of Palestine at that time. Balfour Declaration, right after World War I, was very simple. It was that we would repopulate the land called Palestine, which in fact was Jordan as well. It was what's now Israel and the West Bank plus Jordan. We would repopulate that with Jews who had always claimed that as their land. And the people living there would go in other parts of the Arab world. That sort of immigration and emigration happens all the time. There's nothing sinister or horrible about it. But the Arab world decided to use those Palestinians as the Palestinian Arabs as the tip of a spear because of the Arab leaders' intense anti-Semitism. Put all that together, and what do we have? We have the leaders of Qatar, the leaders of Iran, leaders of many other countries that have decided to dehumanize people in order to inflict horrors on other people. The same is going on here in the United States. And we have to understand that reality, that when you call parents who protest what is going on in their local schools terrorists, and you allow terrorists to roam the streets and murder, which we did in 2020. The people of the largely the blue states allowed that. They did that for a purpose, which was to dehumanize and scare off any opposition to their rule. That's what happened in 2020. That's what's been happening since. People are now being told that if you are a supporter of a certain political candidate, you are a danger to the United States and indeed the world. So we are being dehumanized because I believe in freedom. So I'm one of those who is being called less than human. And if I'm less than human, I'll accept that. Because what's going to happen is when you call people less than human for a long time, they're going to start acting that way. And there will be blood. The only question ahead of us is not, will there be blood? The only question is, what will the blood be spilled for? And which blood will lead to the solution? Which blood will lead to the end? What we take on in the next few decades? Will it be the blood that is spilled for civilization, or the blood that's spilled for barbarism? And it's leaders that are doing this, not the people. The people are being used. And this is monstrous. What happened in Israel in the West Bank, in Gaza, is a monstrous thing brought on by leaders. We have got to get control of our leaders. If we don't, they will try to spill our blood to keep that control. If we allow them to do that, they will do it.
Yeah. Chris, I don't know, to throw it to you here. I mean, as I mentioned, the idea of people on American streets celebrating this, and or any of the reflections you have on what Sam said about, again, this civilizational struggle.
I think that the rise of identity politics that's occurred in the past decade or so is very scary and concerning, because it buys into this false notion of us versus them, the oppressed versus the oppressors. And I think that a lot of people think of Israel as being the oppressors, when it's the complete and utter opposite. And that's why a lot of these academic institutions and organizations are somewhat sympathetic to what's going on in Gaza right now, because they think, oh well, big bad Israel has all these weapons, they have all these technologies at their disposal, and it's just Palestine, and 2 million people living in this tiny little thing, and they're very poor and everyone's against them. That's not the case. So I think first we need to just be morally clear on how we're framing this. But like Sam said, in the United States here, we are nowhere near, the cultural depravity that is, occurring in the Gaza Strip, for a very long time. And it's nothing new to human history. This has been going on since, the Bolsheviks, were saying, oh, the kulaks, they're the problem. Germany, oh, the Jews, they're the problem. So it's that like base instinct of human nature to say, instead of looking at, ourselves and why we are, in the situation we are in, it's all their fault. And if we just get rid of them, or if we, just do something to them, that will solve it. That won't solve it. Even if Hamas were to, get rid of every single Israeli on the face of the earth, that would not in and of itself, make their situation, at least economically speaking, or socially, or whatever, however you want to measure it, better. So it's that that Marxian idea of zero sum game, us versus them. We can't succeed, again, unless they're brought down mentality that has infiltrated so much of America in recent years. And like Sam said, whether it's the FBI and the DOJ saying, oh, if you're for parents' rights and education, then you're a terrorist. That could be broadened out to a lot of other things, and Joe Biden, when he was elected, and, this is not a bash Joe Biden session whatsoever, but one of the things he said was, we're going to reunite, return to normalcy, all these, buzzwords that the American people thought, oh, that's great. That's great. Since he's been in office, he has done the utter opposite. We've all seen the speeches. We've seen the MAGA Republicans, how they're responsible for all the problems. So I think I'm seeing like little seedlings of this. Obviously, we're nowhere near where, one side's calling the other subhuman or anything, but it's scary to see Hillary Clinton, just the other week saying, oh, MAGAs need to be reprogrammed. That sounds a lot like, what Germany was talking about in terms of, oh, we need to, reprogram people who aren't buying into the National Socialist vision. So that's the kind of stuff that scares me. The fact that is not just being completely, untolerated is reason for concern.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, Sam and we'll get us all back here on the screen. Sam, I just want to go back to, is this a flashpoint? Is this a reminder that civilization as we know it is constantly under attack, and that we try to live our lives and not think about these things, but obviously forces of barbarism were unleashed and resulted in some of the most horrible things imaginable. But and I think, again, I mentioned, I think of a soul. Somebody says a decline is a choice, that civilization has to choose decline. That and it tends to do so, I think, in little ways over time. That you do wake up one day and realize that we now live in a civilization that will not defend itself, that will not defend its values, and it will not. It gets to the point where the people who have benefited from civilization, from living and prospering in the United States, are now using their positions gained through the protection of that civilization over, in the United States case, 200 years, 250 years, to defend barbarism, or to not, at the very least, not really defend the civilization that made their lives possible. I mean, what I'm getting at here is that when the war in Ukraine broke out, everybody had Ukrainian flags, not everybody, but people put Ukrainian flags in their social media things. Corporations came out to support Ukraine. Our government and our leaders in Congress came out immediately saying we must stand with Ukraine and all this stuff. And yes, people have said stand with Israel, but conspicuously absent were reactions in support of Israel and against barbarism, against this attack on our civilization, from politicians in this country, certain amounts of them. The Squad, the Socialist Democrats of America, immediately, they actually did issue an immediate statement in support of the terrorists. AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, took her a while to say something. And I think she did release a statement yesterday that was in support of Israel, but it's always this equivocation. And, you have to take that for what you will. But there's if I can share it, if you can't share it, Andy, I'll share it, the tweet that has the statement of some 24 student groups at Harvard University. I'll read it if Andy can't bring it up on the screen. Joint statement by Harvard Palestine solidarity groups on the situation in Palestine. We, the undersigned student organizations, hold the Israeli regime entirely responsible for all unfolding violence. These events did not happen in a vacuum. They talk about an apartheid regime. Today, the Palestinian ordeal enters into uncharted territories. That statement was so out of bounds, Sam Karnick, that the former president of Harvard University, who, by the way, was run out of there by the woke culture that he did not oppose while he was president of Harvard, said that was reading that statement from all those student groups at Harvard made him almost weep for what that university has become. But I think it's actually not all that unrepresentative of what our elite institutions in this country really think and how they've been completely overtaken by not just wokeness, but by absolute enemies of the whole idea of a civilized and peaceful society. Obviously, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complicated. It's not very simple. What happened last week is very simple. Murdering and beheading infants is not something that should take you a little bit of take you some time to come out foursquare against. You should have actually done that after paragliders came in and slaughtered hundreds of people at a peace and music concert. That maybe you should have been good enough to, if not come out in support of Israel, come out against terrorism, and maybe shut your mouth and not say anything at all in support of Hamas. And it's the support of a lot of elite institutions, not just in the United States, but around the world, not to mention the United Nations, that has helped give oxygen to Hamas over these decades. You need moral oxygen in the world in order to endure as long as Hamas has done. Nobody gave Al-Qaeda moral oxygen. Nobody in the West. But here we are now, again, 22 years after 9/11, and we have terrorist sympathizers dancing in our streets and not the streets of horrible regimes elsewhere. So, Sam, or Chris, maybe we just go to you first, Chris, because but the moral rot that seems to have taken hold in so many places of power and influence, basically among the people and institutions that run our society, was really exposed.
Yeah, so I was in college when 9/11 happened, and I remember Noam Chomsky and some on the far left, progressive side of the political spectrum were talking. Oh, this was blowback. This was retaliation
Right.
for the United States being in the Middle East, being involved in the Middle East. I just thought that was such BS then, because how does that explain when terrorists go in and commit violence, in France or in Britain? They didn't, actively participate in the first Gulf War, whatever. But one of the things that struck me, I was a high school teacher for, 5 years or so. I've said this, many times. When we studied World War II, when we studied the Holocaust, almost all of these high school students in my classes, these were sophomores and juniors mostly, they almost knew nothing about the Holocaust. And I remember I kind of went out of my way to make sure that they understood that. So I think that part of this is an indictment of the, education, system in America. We're not teaching them important things like the Holocaust, World War II, the founding of the country, but we're focusing incessantly on DEI, CRT, and all this other stuff that does not have anything to do, with practical knowledge and, what education is truly about. So it's not all that surprising for me to see that the students who I was literally probably teaching, as they're coming of age and they're entering the college ranks, they are, susceptible to the siren calls of, oh, this is kind of Israel really, responsible for this because they're oppressive. And Hamas is really the victim here. And all they were doing was just retaliating. Obviously, that is just complete and utter BS. But it doesn't surprise me because that is what, the higher ups in academia and even in the public schools, even at, the middle schools are teaching kids these days. It's to always be on the side of the victim. It's all about the victim versus the oppressor mentality. And if you're a victim, the rules don't apply to you. You can do whatever. If you're a victim in America because you don't happen to have a high paying job, you can go and loot because that's okay because you're a victim and the rules don't apply. So I think that this is just, I'm kind of spanning a whole bunch of different, factors here. I totally get that. But I think that that's, just another aspect of this that needs to be, identified and resolved. We need to teach our kids, history, because if they don't learn their history, well, then this whole notion of never forget gets forgotten. And we cannot let that happen.
Yeah, Sam, the moral rot at our elite institutions was exposed.
That's exactly what happened. The interesting thing that you might look at here is that how do you get to be defined as a victim or an oppressor? Because you're not a victim of just the sun, you're a victim of human beings. And the way you get defined as a victim or an oppressor is back to blood. And that's why we see an interesting confluence between the American radicals who seem we're openly very sympathetic toward the people who perpetrated these horrors, these atrocities, is that they look at themselves as victims based on their blood, and they look upon the Palestinians as fellow victims based on their blood. But the Palestinians are not victims of a Islamic movement to keep them there as a pain to Israel. No, they're victims of Israel. They're victims of Jews. They're victims by blood of blood. And so what happens here is this is activity by political, educational, cultural, and business leaders around the world to weaponize people against one another. Why? How do the elites benefit from this? This is the big story behind this. It's what connects what happened in the Gaza to what's been happening in the United States and in Europe and the rest of the so-called civilized world. I wonder at this point when I look at a place like Australia, which has the lockdowns were truly monstrous there. They were completely unjustified here, but they were monstrous there, and it was appalling what they did. This is what connects it, is that our elites are weaponizing blood against blood to their own benefit because they get to rule over the wasteland and take whatever's left.
Jim, I just have another tidbit to add here. Couple, I'd say at the beginning of the 19th century, the notion of relativism really, started to gain traction. Relativism in terms of, well, there's not one objective truth. There's a bunch of subjective truths. And, there is no morality because it's all relative. There's no good. There's no evil. There's no right. There's no wrong. This, I think, is an example of all that, coming to fruition, where instead of, people just being able to, state a direct line in the sand and say, that was wrong. And it doesn't matter what's happened in the past. Nothing ever would justify going in and doing what they did. It's just this relativism. But and that to me is really, concerning, because that means that there are no just objective facts. There are no places where you can say, this was right and this was wrong. And I think it's happening in America and across the world. And in America, we're seeing it, like Sam said, the riots and just like all these things of ends justify the means. And, there is no consensus on facts anymore. And I think that just kind of bleeds into this, where people can pick and choose the storyline that they want to to use to defend what they are seeing as, well, here's my side of the story. I think we have to understand that is morally bankrupt.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. And, I kept thinking about what to title this, this discussion. And we actually originally thought maybe we'll talk about some other topics and not just this, but that just seemed wrong. It just seemed there are a lot of other things going on in the world, and we do have some important things that will be on next week's podcast for sure. But, Sam and Chris, you and us three have talked about, being morally serious, being serious about saving your civilization, recognizing the moment and meeting it. Say what you want. Well, I won't even go there, but just the idea that this is a big moment in world history. This will be a week, a day, an attack that will be remembered for decades and for generations. I really believe that. And you have to wonder whether or not your society, represented by the people in government running this United States government, are able to meet the moment. And we found evidence this week that the Biden administration is not morally and even competently prepared to meet the moment. Andy, we have a clip here that we can play where John Kirby, who I believe is the spokesman for the National Security Agency, which is supposed to be all the smart people who know everything and can prepare us for things like this. He was on Fox News, and this was a pretty unserious interview.
That the United States is now involved in wars that are taking place in Europe and also in the Middle East. I want to play this soundbite for you that is just last month in Vietnam and ask you if this still holds for the president. Watch.
The only existential threat humanity faces, even more frightening than a nuclear war, is global warming going above 1.5 degrees in the next 10 years.
Given all the nuclear players in these two areas where we are now engaged on, does the president stand by that comment?
Absolutely, he does. Climate change is an existential threat. It could, it actually threatens and is capable of wiping out all human life on Earth over time. I mean, I don't know how more existential you can get to that, but that doesn't mean that we walk away from our obligations, our national security interests in very dangerous parts of the world.
John, he said it was more frightening than a nuclear war. Is that it's more frightening than a nuclear war in this moment?
The president believes wholeheartedly that climate change is an existential threat to all of human life on the planet. That's just science. That's a fact, Martha.
That's fact.
That's fact. Chris, when I saw that clip, I mean, I wanted to laugh at it. What's going on is much too serious to laugh at. But I think it shows that the ruling class in America, the elites, they absolutely nothing will pull them off of their one fast track agenda of using climate change as an excuse to control society. Not even the most horrific attack against civilization that we have seen in decades, if not longer than that.
Well, could it be that their obsession with climate change caused them to drop the ball on this one? I mean, I'm not saying that is one or the other proposition where they can only focus on climate change. But I mean, there's only so many resources. There's only so much time, effort, and energy to go around. And if he's, parading around the world, talking about climate change being an existential threat, I don't think that he's taking nearly as seriously the existential threat that is evil. And, World War II was, the embodiment of good versus evil. In many of the wars since then, there's been this reluctance to call out good and evil. And like I said, even when I was in college after 9/11, there still were I'm not saying that it was a majority, but there were a lot of talking heads and a lot of people and a lot of my professors who were saying, well, you got to step back and understand that the reason why Al-Qaeda did this was because of A, B, C, D, and E from the United States. And it just always struck me as, but wait a second, you're going and taking commercial airliners and crashing them into buildings and killing civilians has nothing to do with their problems with the United States foreign policy. So it's that kind of thinking that really is just so off-putting and concerning for the future, because this is I think the overarching mentality that a lot of people in our government and in our academic institutions are buying these days, and they're preaching it. And like we said, in Hamas, kids are indoctrinated from a very young age. I mean, I've seen things where they actually make plays with little kids, and some of them are the Jews and some of them are the Hamas terrorists, and they go and they take little wooden swords and stuff and pretend that they're killing the Jews. I'm not saying that that's happening any remotely here in the United States. However, there is a similarity occurring here that I think needs to be called out for what it is.
The use of climate change as a dividing line is emblematic and important. What it does is it takes the group of people, the Americans who are productive, who go to work every day and build things and serve one another, and demonizes them as endangering the lives of other people. That if you are driving your car to work, you are killing somebody somewhere, somehow. This is a way of demonizing people, and it ultimately works to the benefit of the small group of people at the top, allows them to use more and more power in whatever way they choose. And this is why fundamentally the Heartland Institute has opposed the presentation of the climate change issue as exactly what Biden called it, as a threat to the very existence of humanity. No, the threat to the very existence of humanity right now is our leaders. Our leaders are carelessly, yes, our leaders are carelessly willing to bring on a nuclear war. They're risking that in this run up to war in the Ukraine. They're willing to let blood rush through the streets in order to make sure that a particular person doesn't assume the presidency, or to get a particular person out of the presidency. This is madness, but it is calculated madness. It's intentional. It's meant. So when we say that climate change is not an existential threat, what we're saying is we can get by, folks. We don't have to demonize people just for wanting better lives. They want that in India and China, and they're building coal plants at an amazing clip over there while we're closing them down. We're doing way better than they are. We are doing so much more for the environment than they are. That is not to demonize them. What that is to point out that we are not to be demonized, that we are not to be seen as subhuman because somebody drives an SUV. They're not killing anybody by doing that. That's not happening, folks. Yeah. But your government is willing to risk your lives and those of tens of millions of other people for things that they think will give them even more power.
Yeah. Well,
and not to mention that by preventing the United States from producing oil and natural gas here, we're actually helping regimes like Iran, whose economy completely depends on oil.
100%. Yeah. Well, we'll wrap it up here. I got another clip I'm going to play it's the only way I could think of to end on a positive note, and I'll try to set it up in this way. I mean, we talked about how, I think there's a moral sickness in this country and it's exposed when things like this happen, when terrible things like this happen, and certain segments of the population, mostly from our elite institutions, just can't find a moral compass that is not broken. With the statement from the students at Harvard, 37, I think, student groups. I mean, now it's actually, and the good thing is that a lot of these students are now running away from that statement. I saw on Twitter, there was the president of the NYU law school, or her class, I guess, in law school. She had a wonderful, cushy job in a prominent New York law firm, all lined up after she graduated, and she put out a disgusting comment supporting Hamas, and then the law firm made a big public statement saying that we're revoking that job. She can go work somewhere else, maybe find another law firm that doesn't think that's disgusting. I mean, it is New York City, so she's probably likely to find a law firm that will take her on. But people are. This is a moment where you get to see who is in support of civilization and who isn't. And, those students at Harvard, they've been brought up in a world in which words are violence. Well, I think we can say for sure what violence really is. And I would hope that maybe we are going to be tossing away into the dustbin of history the idea that words are violence, but violence is speech, right? Your speech is violence, but my violence is speech. I think this is one of those situations where we can make a very clear line that in a civilized society, it is not that way at all. And so, as I mentioned, Sam and Chris, our elites, a lot of them, especially on the left and in the Democratic Party, were a little hesitant to come out and say the right thing, or even better, keep your mouth shut, say nothing. Saying nothing, was it Mark Twain? Better you keep your mouth shut and not expose yourself as an idiot, other than as opposed to opening your mouth and confirming it. And so we have a lot of that going on in our politics these days. But what I'm hopeful for, and this is the hopeful ending I was looking for, was that although in our Western civilization, in our United States of America, we are cursed with many leaders with broken moral compasses, the people, us, the people that actually sustain and protect our civilization, are the ones who can even perhaps shame those of our leadership that cannot see things with moral clarity. And so there was a rally of some sort, or a speech that was given. Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who is a pretty terrible human being, and Elizabeth Warren were there. And so he was reading a statement about his reaction to what had happened. And we're also going to hear the crowd reaction to that. Go ahead and play that clip, Andy.
There must be a de-escalation of the current violence. The United States should...
The looks on their faces. There was a bit of a lag there in the beginning, but Ed Markey was basically making a very morally neutral, if not basically blaming Israel, and there should be a ceasefire. There should be no more bloodshed. And in fact, I think it was Jack Kirby or somebody else in the United States, high in the United States government. No, I think it was our Secretary of State, issued a statement via Twitter that said we must now have a complete ceasefire and stop all hostilities, which would basically be rewarding Hamas for the worst terrorist attack in decades. And then they took it down. And I think another high-level agency also issued a similar type statement publicly on Twitter, and then they had to take that down. But of course, the internet is forever, and those statements were preserved. But Sam and Chris, maybe to wrap it up here, I mean, I think it is incumbent upon us as the beneficiaries of living in a free and relatively safe and prosperous Western civilization, that if our leaders are not going to step up to protect it, that we must take the mantle and do it ourselves.
Well, let me just piggyback off one thing that you just said earlier. Mark Levin had a lot to say about this on Saturday and Sunday on Fox News. And one of the things that he said is the media cannot do what they've done in the past, where at first they are sympathetic and they are interviewing the survivors and they are pro-Israel. But then when Israel actually retaliates, then they say, whoa, 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 that's way too much. This is, too harsh. We haven't even seen the invasion yet. We've seen some airstrikes on behalf of Israel into Gaza, and I've already seen on MSNBC and CNN that line of thinking of, okay, that's enough. Like, okay, stop now. This is just the beginning. This is, as Benjamin Netanyahu said, it's going to be a long war. It's going to be a lot of long days. This is going to be urban fighting. This is going to be house to house, door to door, street to street. A lot of these IDF forces are just reservists, and they're going to have to go into Gaza, a very heavily, populated area, and they're going to have to go in there and get every single one of these terrorists out. So this is going to be a long process. It's going to be, bloody. It's going to be deadly, and we need to maintain our resolve in defense of Israel, and not when the media starts to change their tune on this and say, okay, Israel's done enough. It's time to seek peace. No, So that's where I'm at in this.
Sam, I was trying to finish on a positive note. Can you bail us out?
I actually do have something positive to say. It's this, that the defenders of civilization can win. We can win this. There is hope. We can win this. The way we're going to have to go about it, though, is we have to understand with perfect clarity who is really trying to harm whom, who is oppressing whom, who, frankly, your declared enemies are. Who are your avowed enemies? They're out there. They say it. We need to recognize that around the world, most Palestinian people don't want to fight Jews. Most Russians don't want to fight Ukrainians. Most Chinese don't want to fight Indians or fight people living on Taiwan. It's the leaders of these places that want us fighting one another so that they can rule over us. Even if they are just ruling over wreckage, they would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. We can fight back, but we have to know who really has declared themselves to be our enemies.
Yes. Well, thank you, Sam. That was, I'll give it a 51% on the positive note. I appreciate that very much. And thank you, Christine Laurel, for the $10 donation in the super chat. She says it takes a lot of courage to talk about this. Bravo. Thank you. I don't know if it takes courage to talk about it. I think I feel compelled to speak about things like this. And I think this is a potentially a civilization defining moment. And we're going to find out whether we are on the path to the Roman Empire and its end, or somewhere else. And there I go again. I wasn't ending it on a positive note. Thank you, Chris Talgo, for being on the program, as you always are today. And I appreciate the patience of our usual viewership and listenership on podcasts for putting up with me as a host instead of the great Donald Kendall, who shall be back next week. Sam Karnick, how can people that listen to this or watch this program learn more and contact you?
Thank you very much, Jim. There's at ST Karnick on X and other places. And then, of course, the heartlanddailynews.com. Please come and visit and leave comments there.
Yes. And Chris Talgo, what do you have to push today?
Well, as always, I encourage everyone to go check out heartland.org, because we've got a bunch of great stories, articles, and a new report on ESG that we'd love everyone to go check out.
Excellent. And you can always find me at Jay Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter, or I should say X is our account there. And always visit heartland.org. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will talk to you next week.